Good evening to all of our viewers on Globespan 24x7 as we continue our Monday night program to bring you the issues of the day. We are very pleased tonight for Nohar Singh for making this platform available, and of course to Devin Bisu, our technical specialist. Especially thankful to our audience who have gracefully been with us over these past months. Your comments are sometimes not heartening, but by all means, continue to make your comments on our program. This evening, we are very honored and privileged to have with us no stranger to the body politics of Guyana. He has been one of the few persons who have been around for decades in the political arena, part of the University of Guyana, and of course, most of his life as part of the People's National Congress. Tonight, we want to welcome to our program Commissioner at GECOM, Mr. Vincent Alexander. Mr. Alexander, welcome to the program tonight.
Thank you very much, Charles.
And of course, with me is my co-host, Dr. Rose. Dr. Rose, are you still not in the US?
I'm somewhere overing all over the globe. Welcome, thanks, Charles, and welcome to the program, all our listeners from North America, the Caribbean, Guyana, and elsewhere.
Thank you, Dr. Rose. Mr. Alexander, generally when we have guests on our program, our audience who are sympathetic to the PPP would be very nasty to some of the comments that our guests make. On the other hand, our viewership who are sympathetic to the PNC also have the same attitude. So Guyana, as we know, seems to be traversing on this path for many, many, many years. Will it end? I don't know. Tonight, I would ask that I know you're politicians leaning more to the PNC, but if it's possible for us to have some candid discussion, whether it's the view of the PNC, it's the view of the PPP, it's the view of none of the two, so that the Guyana, hopefully at the end of this program, we can play our small part in bringing our people together. Having said that, Mr. Alexander, can you tell our audience, I know you've been on these programs many times and other programs, but I'm not sure our audience know exactly about all your background. We know at one time you were at the University of Guyana and you hold different portfolio within the PNC. Can you tell us exactly part of your life, what it has been over these years?
Well, indeed, the University of Guyana has been a great part. I spent 25 years there, starting as a research fellow in the Institute of Development Studies, moving on to be the Deputy Registrar for 13 years, 6 years. My research area was local government. I started local government as a regional executive officer in Region 3 in the 80s, to be a research fellow and a lecturer in local government, and have found some space on the consulting landscape in relation to local government. I also served for approximately 8 years on the local government task force, the outcome of which has been pieces of legislation to reform the local government system, including the now controversial Local Government Commission. I started my political career as a youth in the Young Socialist movement. I became its leader. I served as leader for 2 years before going off to study. My master's is in law, which I acquired in Moscow, so I'm not a common law lawyer, so to speak, but I do have a master's in law. I served in the PNC as its vice chairperson and acting chair, and have been a commissioner of GECOM as of 2007. The same year I stopped being a member of the People's National Congress. I'm also involved in the Burnham Foundation as its chairperson. And as you mentioned, the Commission of Elections Commission, and I've served in other capacities, including chairperson of the National Accreditation Council and chairperson of the Caribbean Area Network for Quality Assurance in Tertiary Education. I think that would suffice.
Excellent. You have a very accomplished resume there, Mr. Alexander. But you mentioned one of part of your resume is that you're president or chairman of the Burnham Foundation. Was there any celebration recently for his passing? He passed on August the 6th, I believe, in 1985, if that date is correct.
That's correct.
Commemoration for his passing.
Well, the Burnham Foundation itself did not have commemoration. We have, in some regards, been handicapped by COVID. We haven't quite morphed into it. We have done some, but we are not quite there. So that we haven't ourselves did not, but we did participate in the activity of the People's National Congress reform, where we, as usual, laid a thorough tribute at the museum. We also would have had a television program. We have a monthly television program, and on the last program, would have paid attention to the life of Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham. That's a monthly program aired on Channel 9 on the last Sunday at 10 a.m.
You mentioned, Mr. Alexander, you're entering the politics at a very early age. Was there any inclination in your entry to politics to join the PPP, or was it automatically you'd have been a PNC?
Well, I was invited to join the YSM. I don't think that I was quite naturally inclined to politics, but a schoolmate of mine beseeched me, and I joined the YSM. I was never invited during that period to join the PYO.
But don't you think that is one of the, and again, listen, the past is the past, but do you think that this contributes to the division of our country, where the natural progression of an Indian is to move into the PYO or the PPP, the natural progression of an African is to move into the PNC, the YSM? Isn't that contributory factor, or one of the contributory factor to our division as we have now, that there was hardly many intercrossing within the two ethnic groups to the different parties?
I wouldn't say that that's a natural factor that has caused us to be with that. I think the natural factor, if one were to consider it, would not join in, but some elements of the politics that has been practiced over the years. So it's not a joining itself, because my joining and my involvement in the YSM and the PNC had much more to do with the ideology than with the coming together of people of African descent. I think I was more ideological in terms of my joining than ethnic.
Isn't that the same answer the Indian would have given to joining the PPP? That's saying that, listen, Cherry was no communist. He's only proclaimed as one, but he was actually more of a free market, economy, which is what they said he proved when he became president and premier and so on. So that argument of being, the political persuasion of the party leader rather than ethnicity seems to be hiding behind the cloud, Mr. Alexander, don't you think?
Let me say two things about that. I don't agree with the argument that Chedi was free. Chedi, over the years, maintained his position as a Marxist, Leninist. He maintained that. I think circumstances in Guyana and in the world at large caused him in 1992 thereafter to pursue a particular path. But that path is not necessarily a reflection of his deep ideological disposition. I would say I have to speak to my own being, and that for me, I have maintained this position ideologically, which would separate me in some regards from people who join primarily for ethnic reasons, so that I can stand above that fray, because I still maintain an ideological position which sometimes could be seen clearly to be some distance away from the practice of the People's National Congress, and I dare say from the practice of the PPP as well.
And what I like in this new dispensation, if you want to call it that, both with the PNC and the PPP, is that in this new parliament, it's a real good makeup of Guyana's ethnic group. The PNC have a lot of Indians and Amerindians and Africans, of course, and so the PPP also have a lot of Africans and Amerindians and, of course, Indians within their member of parliament. So I think maybe even the past has haunted us with all this division. It appears to me that the future seems a bit brighter, because in both parties, they're attracting people from all ethnic groups, which I think is a good thing for Guyana, don't you think?
Well, I would respond this way, and I might be seen to be biased, but if one follows the composition of the slate of the People's National Congress over the years, there has always been a fair representation of people of Indian descent. If one follows the government of the People's National Congress, there's always been a fair representation and people in fairly senior positions in that. And in fact, the era of Maury, who was on the verge, I think, of becoming the leader of the People's National Congress, God forbid he died before that could have occurred, is a reflection of the extent to which the People's National Congress, in its leadership, has been able to attract people of Indian descent. I would say that that attraction, to a very large extent, again, would have been ideological, particularly under the Hart regime. When he pursued the economic program, I think there were a lot of Indo-Guyanese, some of whom were previously PPP, who came to the side of Hart for ideological purposes.
Yeah, and that's a fair point. But also there was discussion in the Indian community that the Indians that the PNC had in their ranks were kind of window dressing rather than people of real authority. I might be wrong, your perception might be wrong, but that's how the Indian, or a lot of the Indian Guyanese saw those people. And even the member of parliament that you mentioned, that Indians were on the ticket, but they were not necessarily the voice in parliament for the PNC, as the Indians on the other side were the Africans in the PPP was not as vocal as the Indians in the PPP side. So I guess both sides can also be accused of window dressing with other ethnic group to show that they're multi-ethnic, when in fact the base of the party is of one ethnic group.
Suffice to say that I don't think people like Sonny Ramphal, I don't think people like Shahabuddin, I don't think people like Winston Murray, people like Kami Ramsarup could be seen as window dressing. They were relatively influential in the party and even more influential in the government. So I would say that they were Indians of stature who, out of whatever conviction, were in the People's National Congress and were not merely window dressing, they were an essential part. I don't think that Ranjit Chandi Singh was window dressing. I think Ranjit Chandi Singh came because of ideological conviction. Not only did he come, but he ended up heading the ideological college of the People's National Congress, called the Ideological College, and became General Secretary. So I would say that, yes, there may be an element of window dressing in the two parties in terms of the composition. I say that they are significant and substantial Indians who were in the leadership of the People's National Congress, and more particularly in government, where they held positions able to influence the policy with People's National Congress.
And wouldn't you say the same thing applies to the PPP?
In that regard, I don't think one can easily find a parallel in the PPP.
And that's the question I was going to. Don't you see the parallel in the PPP where Guyanese of African descent also held very important position and decision making in the PPP?
Well, I was bold enough to mention the names of the persons who I felt held positions and were illogical. I have a difficulty in finding the equivalent in the PPP. I have a difficulty. One may argue that Ejil is now such a person. I may argue that. But I don't think that we can match pound for pound the number of persons in the People's National Congress government who are influential and of Indian descent to the number of people in the PPP government who were of African descent and influential.
So when you say people like Dr. Lunchan and Sam Hines and as you mentioned, the bishop, there is the Home Affairs Minister. You're saying that these people are not influential?
I have tremendous respect for Dr. Lunchan, and I would contend that, yes, he would have been influential. I have worked with people like Globespan and Conor, and what has been my experience? I would have interactions with these people in political dialogue, and we would reason and come to a consensus on a particular matter. And they would come back to me and say, sorry, but there's a term they use to suggest that they are mere agents. That as agents, they no longer have the authority to go forward with what we had agreed to. And I've seen this over and over, coming from, as I said, more in the local government task force, coming from Globespan. They simply come back and say to you, sorry, I mean, we discussed, but I'm trying to find the term, the particular term they use is a term common to them, but as if to say we are agents, and as agents, what we agreed to is not acceptable to where we came from, and therefore it no longer stands. That to me differed from my own disposition, because when I took a position on matters, I gained the support and was able to move forward in that regard. And in some regards, particularly in the area of local government, was given a relatively free hand. Now, I'm an Afro-Guyanese, so it's not a parallel in terms of what we're talking about. But the point that I'm making is that, well, the PNC in some regards seem to have more leverage for its representatives to bargain and take positions as opposed to the PPP. I think they have a more command system.
Dr. Rose?
Mr. Vincent Alexander, good night, sir, and it's a pleasure having you here today. Now, you have always been a prolific speaker, an astute politician, well-versed in the Constitution and the politics of Guyana. Now, in 2007, when you ran for the leadership, I think for the PNC, you called for a change of party culture. What does that mean?
I called for a change of political culture.
Okay.
And in calling for a change of political culture, I was speaking not only to the party, beginning with the party, because I'm of the view that the political culture of the nation needs to be changed. But where I stood, I thought we should start in the party. One of the things that I considered very important was for us to move away from this situation where we have this leader who is enshrined and cannot be challenged. I felt that there was a need for the leadership to be based on a competitive situation of ideas rather than a kind of almost a monarchy. A monarchy. So that was one of the things I thought that needed to be changed. I also felt that we needed to practice what I call at the time ethnic politics. Ethnic politics. And let me hasten to explain what I meant by that. My position was in the party, and I did postulate this internally, that people of African descent in the party were in a very good position to articulate interests of people of African descent. And that people of Indian descent should not come to the party attempting to articulate the interests of people of African descent, or this broad thing called, that they should bring to the table the disposition of people of Indian descent, so that the People's National Congress could have a conversation between the two ethnics, coming to understand what were the issues that confronted the group individually, and seeking as a party, based on that conversation, to articulate solutions to the issues confronting each of the groups, whilst at the same time recognizing that there's some issues that were national issues, common to both groups, and articulating those as well. So that was another position that I took in the party. And whilst the party did not necessarily back against it in articulation, I did not see the kind of action that was required to make it a reality. Thirdly, I felt that there was too much, and this is related to the first point I make, too much subjectivism in the party, in the manner in which things were looked at. And that is one that led to difficulties in people competing for leadership. So I felt we needed to move away from this ultimate leader and to provide for competition at that level, and that we needed to have open and clear discussion, and coming out of that, clear articulation of policies in how we would address the issues confronting the various ethnic groups, and no exclusion to the Amerindians, and then also articulating views about the national issues. I felt we were falling short in that regard, and I felt sometimes that the internal politics was driven more by the desire to occupy office rather than the real interests of the party and the real interests of the nation. And so I proposed a change of political culture, which change I felt should start it in the party, and the party should then, having attained the moral ground, bring that change to the nation at large.
Okay. To all our PNC and PEP supporters out there, we know Mr. Alexander has been fighting for the PNC in a number of different platforms. But for those of you who believe that he's a member of the PNC party, you are wrong. He resigned. He did not renew his membership card in 2007. Mr. Alexander, can you tell us why you did that?
Well, I did that at the time of the competition for leadership. I felt the manner in which he dealt with the unacceptable. I was treated as if I were trying to destroy the party, as if I were an enemy. I was abused, and therefore I felt I was no longer in good company. I was no longer in good company. It was not the place for me to be. If my position for a new political culture was seen as something that's destructive, then I was in the wrong place at that time.
When Mr. Granger became the leader of the PNC party, I think it was in 2010, did you ever thought of rejoining the party?
I was invited to rejoin the party, and my response at that time was, if I seek evidence of the direction I think the party should go in, then they could call me the next day. I had not at that time seen sufficient evidence, and therefore I did not respond to the call, which they did make the next day.
Okay, let me get to the meat of of this discussion here tonight. You know, in 2018, the no confidence motion was passed, failed. No, it was passed by the PEP with 33 votes. But the AP and UAFC government claimed that they needed 34 votes. Do you ever think for one moment in your mind that the courts were going to upheld such a decision?
I was not a proponent of that, but I allow people and their legal thinking to pursue their course of action. So I was not a proponent of that. If I had a choice, I would not be putting forward that argument. But having said that, I felt that there was a serious problem with the morality of the no confidence motion. We do not have a political system where individuals are elected by a constituency. And I have a difficulty with someone who is elected by a slate, on a slate, who in a sense is a member or a guest of a slate, to use that position to bring the entire slate down. I think there's a difference voting on issues and using your position. You are extracted from a list by a party leader to represent that party in the National Assembly, and to use that to bring down the entire government and the entire party. I think it's immoral, and I would even go as far as to argue if one looks carefully at our electoral system, if one looks carefully at how we deal with the question of crossing the floor, which we changed during the Jagdeo-Corbyn period, that motion was loaded with immorality and would dare say could be legally argued against as well. So I am someone who looked at the occurrence, and I felt it was one of the dark days in our political history.
So you're saying, in other words, Sharon, that was immoral to bring the party down. But
certainly
the question, pardon me?
Certainly.
Okay. So the next question to you then: do you think the coalition government was immoral not to call election within the 3 months as prescribed in the Constitution?
Well, the extent to which there were legal proceedings that, in a sense, allowed for that is the extent to which one has to live with that reality. They didn't just in government and defy the ends. They sought to challenge it in the electoral system. Now, one has to see the reality of our politics. When the APNU brought such a motion against Ramatar, what did he do? He also found a way in which he was able to prolong his stay in government. It's the nature of the politics, and it speaks to the question that I may have talked to earlier, the need for a change in our political culture. We seem to think that our political culture is all about who is smarter and who can outmaneuver people, and there seems to be an acceptance in Guyana that politics is just about being smarter than the other guy. And I really don't think that we can absolutely take that position. I think lines have to be drawn somewhere in terms of politics being smart.
Mr. Alexander, you have been appointed a commissioner of GECOM, representing the People's National Congress Reform Party. And that was almost like 2 decades ago. Now, in this last election in 2020, pardon me?
14 years ago.
14 years ago, okay, fine, stand corrected. In the last election, as of July 2019, there were 786,000 Guyanese in Guyana, includes babies right up to the oldest person. But GECOM put out a list of over 600,000 people registered to vote, just leaving about 100,000+ as under 18 years old. That list, as you know, was bloated because only 460,000 people voted. Why didn't GECOM get it right?
Let me say two things. First, let me respond to your description. In my view, from a constitutional perspective, I was a nominee of the then opposition to the Elections Commission. I would seek to divide between being a nominee and being a representative. Of course, as a nominee, I would have to take into consideration the views of the body who nominated me. But I am not the representative for it's a constitutional office. You considered me competent to be in that office. I was appointed by a constitutional order by the president of the day and see myself as a nominee. That fact became even obvious when the then leader of the People's National Congress, Mr. Robert Corbyn, publicly said that I should have resigned from GECOM. And my response to him was that I'm holding a constitutional office. I'm not sitting there at his behest. He may have nominated me, but we've gone past that. And that therefore his call would be of no effect. And so I continued to occupy that position as a constitutional position. So I do not see myself as a representative, though much of what I do and say may coincide with the interests of the People's National Congress. I don't necessarily see myself as a representative. GECOM did not get it right. And GECOM did not get it right because of the nature of GECOM. GECOM had agreed in 2008 that periodically we would have house-to-house registration to have a new voters list. We'd agreed to that. Unfortunately, and stupidly I would say, in 2016, I think it was, the then government did not vote the money required for GECOM to conduct house-to-house. Those monies were not voted until 2018 for the conduct of those of the house-to-house in 2019. When we had the no confidence motion, the people who had agreed that we should have house-to-house recanted and said, look, there's a no confidence motion. The only thing we need now is an election. GECOM as a collective was fractured and therefore was in no position to do otherwise. GECOM was fractured. And it is that fractured GECOM that maintained the status quo and went into elections with a bloated list. And I have made it abundantly clear subsequent to that what my disposition was about two things. My disposition about the relevance of our electoral system to Guyana's growth and development, and my disposition to the conduct of the elections and its legitimacy in terms of a result which it produced. And that's in the public domain. So I have two problems. I really don't, though I'm a GECOM, I really don't believe our electoral system serves us. I am quite aware that when we were involved in the constitutional reform, there was a consensus that we would do much more about the electoral system. We could not at that time move in the direction of the constituencies because the rule of the court commanded us to have elections by 2001. We didn't have time to draw up the constituencies that we can do under the Constitution. The Parliament agreed, we agreed that we would go to the elections following the court order, but after the election, return to the reform process, particularly the electoral reform process. It demonstrated they didn't have the will nor the commitment, and so they retained the system which they and the nation had said should be changed. And I maintain today it should be changed.
Okay. Mr. Alexander, I love your short, candid, and to the point answers. You want a few guests that are to the point like this. Charles, over to you.
Mr. Alexander, we want to take a short commercial break now. When we come back, we will continue this discussion as Dr. Rose just mentioned. So audience, don't go anywhere. We'll be right back shortly.
Waiting in line to buy your food, losing time, gas, and patience? Then let All From One Suppliers send your meals directly to your home. Order your curry, chicken curry, or duck, or even goat, plus your dalpuri and bus-up-shut from allfromonesupplier.com. We ship your meals directly to your home so you can enjoy it upon arrival. Or you can freeze it and take it out whenever you're ready to eat. No more waiting in lines and no more losing time. Treat yourself with a tasty curry and roti. You could also get all your solos, ices, peardrax, coconut water, and much more from allfromonesupplier.com. It's free shipping on all your curry duck curry, chicken, goat, sodas, and all West Indian items. Log on to allfromonesupplier.com today or call 718-551-3292. Remember, it's free shipping across the U.S. Dave West Indian Products is the only distributor of 100% authentic West Indian products. Dave West Indian supplies fish, vegetables, curry, spices, sodas, and coconut water, plus geese and much more straight from Guyana and the Caribbean. For all your shopping needs, visit Dave's Guyana Fish and Grocery Market. Dave West Indian products are also available in West Indian stores, Key Food, and allfromonesupplier.com. Dave West Indian has a full line of the most desirable products to fit all your needs. So visit Dave Guyana Fish and Grocery Market on 118th Street on Liberty Avenue, or Maryland at 7505 New Hampshire Ave, or any West Indian stores, or allfromonesupplier.com. Dave West Indian, your 100% authentic West Indian product. Thank you to all of our Travelspan and Amrose Travels customers and staff. We are still operating after COVID shutdown thanks to all of your support. Our staff has made the best efforts during COVID to speak with the airlines on your behalf. They stayed on hold for hours sometimes with the airlines to rebook your reservations. We are happy to serve. Our offices are operating at 10809 Liberty Avenue, Richmond Hill, New York, and our Val Park office and GT offices are open as well. Travelspan survived these 27 years with our customers, staff support, and God. In our 27 years, we are grateful to be here with you in the community. So call us today in New York at 718-845-0437. In Trinidad, call 645-1604. And in Georgetown, call 227-1701. And Rose Hall, call 337-4287. Folks, the Nest Restaurant is the place to dine for Guyanese and Caribbean dishes. It is the best restaurant in Queens. The staff is courteous, and Dave, the owner, is always there to welcome you. So for a memorable dining experience, visit the Nest Restaurant located at 12717 101 Avenue, South Richmond Hill. Go and make a reservation today or takeout. Call 718-847-4035. For all your plumbing, heating, and cooling needs, call Zim Mechanical Inc. at 347-456-8885. Zim Mechanical Inc. installs boilers, hot water heaters, and cooling systems. Located at 9732 Waltham Street, Jamaica, Queens, Zim Mechanical Inc. also repairs and troubleshoots your gas, heating, and cooling systems. For quotes on prices and repairs, call 347-456-8885.
Welcome back to our program. To our audience, thank you for staying on with us. So we have with us Commissioner Vincent Alexander, representing the PNC in the Elections Commission. Mr. Alexander, I want to go back to the question that Dr. Rose asked you, and you spoke of the vote by Charandas being unethical. We understand that. I think everybody understands that maybe it's unethical, but was it unconstitutional? Can a member of parliament vote for any issue on his or her own without the party sanctioning it?
I would be bold enough to argue that legally one could not occur. I'd be bold enough to argue that point. I think that if one looks at our electoral system, we have an electoral system where you vote for a slate. You don't vote. We have a system where the leader of the party can remove you from parliament by simply writing to the speaker indicating that they lost confidence in you. Without to give any reason. And this is what the parties agreed to. So I'm saying in the context, you can remove a parliamentarian simply because you lost confidence. Suggests that accepted that the parliamentarian has to be committed to the line of the government. In addition to that, the very electoral system itself, where it's a slate, and people don't vote for you, they vote for the slate, suggests that if you were to go and if you vote on an issue, then what you're doing is participating in the act of policy formulation and legislation. But when you vote to bring the party down, I think it's a different kind of a vote. It's the kind of a vote which I think flies in the face of our electoral system and our disposition towards removing people from a particular slate. I think it flies in the face of that. And I think that one can even build a legal argument as to whether a parliamentarian in our circumstances can be allowed to vote to bring down the entire slate of which he is a part, as opposed to voting on an issue. And I think that is where one has to make the differentiation.
But Mr. Alexander, after the vote took place, the Speaker, Dr. Barton Scotland, even after the appeal from the government, he upheld that decision. So what legal argument could have been found to say that the vote of Charandas was unconstitutional? I'm not hearing that.
Well, two things. One, he is entitled to his legal opinion, and he expressed that. He's entitled to his legal opinion, he expressed that, and one has to respect that. But I am saying that the question of how one is elected to Parliament is something enshrined in our law. And if one looks at how that occurs, one can argue that someone is elected not in his own right. One is elected on a slate, and therefore has to act in concert with that slate. And the fact that he or she has to act in concert with the slate is demonstrated by the way in which the law provides for the representative of the list to remove that person from Parliament. So I'm saying that there is a construct that one can put forward which says, look, this cannot be an entitlement of a parliamentarian in our circumstances to vote to bring down the entire government, of which, in a sense, I say he or she is a guest of that slate. So there's a difference between going to Parliament and voting on the issue. And there is a concept in our parliamentary procedures as well, where we actually say that there are issues where parliamentarians are allowed to have a free will, and there are other issues where the whip determines what happens. That is in the Parliament as well.
But I come back
when we were dealing with the abortion bill, it was declared then, at that time, that we'd be allowed to vote of our free will. Not the practice in the Parliament of Guyana.
right.
What Charandas did is an aberration.
But as you said, the parliamentarians are extracted from a list. Now, when they get into Parliament, are they beholden to the party or to the people who selected them on that list? I mean, the people had to vote for the party. The number of votes will give you the seats that you're allocated to you. When your parliamentarian goes to parliament, are they beholden to the party or to the people who elected them? Because I'm saying that because Sharon Das did explain why he voted against the government. Because he's from Kanji, he saw what was happening to the workers, and he think that was unconscionable what the coalition was doing. So if it's unethical, I think his conscience directed him to vote that way. What do you say about that?
Well, the people vote for the party. The people vote for the party.
Right.
They don't vote for the individual members. So that's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make the parliaments have to be responsive to the people who voted for the party. And I don't know on what basis Sharon Das could contend that he was reflecting the view of the people who voted for the APNU-AFC coalition. Even from the standpoint of his contention that he was from Kanji and what was happening to the people of Kanji couldn't live with it, if one looks at the way in which those people voted, they didn't necessarily vote for Sharon Das or the party that he represented. Assumed representation of people other than those who voted him in. And in fact, went against the will of the people, I would say, who voted him in. So yes, you may want to argue that the parliamentarian should be looking to the people's interests. But if one looks at the configuration in this instance, whose interest was Sharon Das representing? Was it the interests of those who voted him in? And so again, I come back to my configuration which says, look, you are of a slate. The people vote for that slate. You have to be responsive to the slate and or the people who voted for that slate. Was Sharon Das being responsive to the slate and or the people who voted for the slate? My answer would be no.
Okay.
He perceived of a constituency of his own, which didn't vote for him, and the stats can bear that to a very large extent.
Okay.
And sought to use his predisposition, to impose his disposition relating to that constituency on a slate of which he was a guest. It's highly unethical.
Okay, as I said, it might be unethical, but a conscience vote is also. I think, in my view,
that's the term I was evading me. A conscience vote. We have a situation in there where conventionally a conscience vote is exercised when the whip says, on this matter, our parliamentarians will exercise the conscience vote. We have that convention where the whip says that. Now, we mightn't agree with that from a theoretical standpoint of pure democracy, but this is what pertains. And I'm saying the way in which, and here is my extension of the argument, the way in which we deal with removal of a parliamentarian clearly shows what is the expectation of a parliamentarian, and that way is a legal way. And therefore, I would throw that element into the argument about how you deal with someone who ends up using a conscience vote, so to speak, to bring down the list of which he or she. I'm very firm in my conviction in this regard.
Okay, and that's a fair point, and I think, but it's history now. It's already done, and maybe what you're arguing there is we should go back to constituent representation, and that will avoid all these, doubts about party lists and so on. So
when I spoke about us not going back to our electoral system, the greater part of that, in fact, is to introduce constituencies. My own view is that we should only use PR to balance the equation. We should not use PR to determine parliamentarians at large. We should use it to balance the equation. And therefore, in a country where the difference, we have had elections, 3-4 elections, where the difference between the two major parties has not exceeded 20,000 in any instance. I would argue that we need to get a maximum number of our seats to be constituency seats, and just to use them as top-up seats to solve the equation that we sought to solve in 1964, and in that way to introduce parliamentarians who are answerable to constituencies rather than parliamentarians who are answerable to a list. So I do agree in that regard.
And that's for a different discussion. We'll come back to that. But let's get to the 2020 election, Mr. Alexander, if you don't mind. In 2007, it was Vincent Alexander who called out Gokul Budu on this miscalculation of votes. And I believe it was because of your intervention, the PPP lost one seat. I was awarded either to the AFC, I believe it was awarded to the AFC. Why didn't Vince Alexander do the same thing in 2021 when Lowingfield was doing the same thing with Region 4?
Well, first of all, let me clarify the 2006 position. Let me clarify that. 2007 position. Let me clarify that. There is a lot of subtlety in the language used about what Budu did. Budu did not miscalculate. Budu, the chief elections officer, who had used a particular formula on 2 prior occasions. In 2007, Budu applied a different formula. A different formula. The man who used a particular formula, using 65 as a divisor to get the number of votes equivalent to a seat, in 2007 used 40. For me, this was not a miscalculation. This was an attempt at fraud that did not succeed. When I called out Budu, his initial response was that he had done nothing wrong, everything was. That was his initial response. And one must bear in mind that Budu did something similar in the 2006 elections. In fact, the elections we should be talking about is 2011. He did something similar in 2006 when he allocated an AFC seat to the PPP in Linden. And when the AFC went to GECOM, GECOM agreed and undertook to correct it. Budu proceeded to announce the result and then told the AFC, sorry, the results have been announced, you have to go to court. So there's a lot of clouding the issue about Budu. Now let's get to 2020. When I did what I did in 2011, the response of the PPP was that the system worked. The system worked. That is, that we were able to correct whatever it was, and they called it a miscalculation. The system worked. Budu remained in office until the end of his contract. He remained in office, having attempted to perpetrate fraud in our electoral system. And having perpetrated it, in 2006. So I get our system. In our electoral system, there are 10 electoral districts. Each electoral district does its own declaration of results. The center does not get involved in the declaration at the level of the 10 electoral districts. What the center does is to receive the results of those 10 electoral districts and to determine whether those results reflect a parallel count that the center would have done and determine whether to approve or not to approve. A count was going on. We, the commissioners, were collectively receiving statements of poll for each polling station, which means that we were accumulating the results ourselves. There was a fracas in Region 4. Commissioners abandoned their position, their role, to collect those statements of poll, and got involved in Region 4, where normally the region, the district, does its own thing. We, the commissioners, by virtue of that, denied ourselves the nation that would have been at our disposal had Lowenfield brought to us a Mingo result to say this is incorrect. We denied ourselves that and became involved in the fracas, and everything else escalated out of that.
Okay.
The Mingo result.
Mr. Alexander, can I stop?
The Mingo result was not brought to us.
Okay.
We went then into a recount. Lowenfield are centered around the recount. They're not centered around the Mingo result. They're centered around the recount, and his postulation, they were votes which were not eligible votes, based on incidents that occurred and his interpretation of what at that time the appeal court had said.
But you answer my question, Mr. Alexander. In 2006, you spoke out against Bodu's formula. We didn't hear Vincent Alexander speaking out against Mingo or Lowenfield in 2020. Why?
In 2020, Vincent Alexander said that there should be no declaration of results because I felt that there was a lot of controversy in relation to the results, including the issue of 47 boxes on the East Coast, which could not be accounted for, including the fact that the chief immigration officer verified that persons who were ticked off and voted were not in the country at the time, and the registrar of deaths and births verified that there were persons ticked off as voting who were registered as dead. So from that perspective, my disposition was we were in no position to declare a result. That was my submission, and I have a publication in that regard, which is in the public domain.
Mr. Alexander,
I did not condone Lowenfield. What I said is that we're in no position, given all of the issues that would have arisen, to declare a result, and therefore what Islam should do is have a non-declaration.
When you I don't know if you listened to Mr. Lowenfield when Dr. Serge Bali was chairman of GECOM. And he was, I know Dr. Rose mentioned about the list being padded, and we talk about that, but Mr. Lowenfield spelled it out very clearly that no one can come and vote for Charles Sugrim if Charles Sugrim is not there. Now, you can vote for Charles Sugrim provided you answer certain questions. For instance, he said, and your mother's date of birth is, and you'll have to mention it. And your mother's name is, and you'll have to mention it. And your date of birth is, and you'll have to say it. If those things are true, what Mr. Lowenfield said then, how is it possible that a dead person can vote and a person overseas can vote unless the person who voted for them know all these answers, and they have to be in conformity with the presiding officer, deputy presiding officer, the polling agents, and everybody else who was there at the polling station. It doesn't really make sense, even though you're saying that.
Let me make sense of it. Let me make sense of it. Ask Mr. Jerry Gavile if prior to the election, we had extensive discussions and at one time seemed to have come to a compromise, which he reneged on, that I argue that the critical element in the elections was the human factor. That notwithstanding his claim of a perfect system, that the system could be foiled by the human factor. Ask him if I argued that before the elections. Not after, but before. Ask the Carter Center if I didn't argue that, and if the Carter Center, as a consequence of my argument, didn't make a position that we should publish all of the names of the persons that could be provided by the Register of Deaths and by the Immigration Office, and have those names in the polling station, so that if people come to vote and those names pop up, the electoral officials and the party agents will be in the position to say, we have a problem with those names. That was a proposition of the Carter Center. This is before the elections. Now I come to the point that you raised. As I said, the Register of Deaths has verified in writing, and we all have the document, that there were names of people who were dead who were taken off and voted. Immigration officers did the same thing. So we juxtapose that to your point, it doesn't make sense. And here's the sense it makes. If I want to vote for a dead person, what do? I acquire the person's ID card. If I want to vote for somebody overseas, I acquire their ID card. And I go and I vote with that ID card. I don't have to answer any question. I just have to get full officials with that ID card. Having done that, I can now return to vote for myself with an affidavit, and I have all the answers. I have all the answers. We have 3,000 approximate polling stations. It only requires, on the average, the perpetration of such acts in each polling station to get out that it's in question. Only requires 2 to 3. Bearing in mind, on what I've just said, that the human factor in the polling station itself sometimes is accommodating of these misdeeds. We have had a situation in Eccles in 2011, where in fact people were caught doing exactly that. But we caught the act, someone already voted, and we had to remove the returning we had to remove the
presiding officer,
official at that time. These things are doable.
Mr. Alexander.
Charles, if I can just interject here. Yeah. Mr. Alexander, just want to have clarity on this. You just said that if someone is dead, John Jones is dead, and I go to obtain John Jones' ID card, I can now go and use that ID card to go and vote. Is that what you said?
I'm saying that, yes.
Okay, so the person in the polling booths supposed to look at my face, see if I resemble that person in the ID card.
They should.
Are you telling me they did not?
They should.
You're telling me that they had 5 GECOM representatives there, which I was told 1 returning officer, I think is a polling agent, and 3 polling clerks. Plus you had about 8 or 9 different party agents there. And none of them will look at these people's faces to see if they does match ID card.
I am saying to you that that is possible. And I would invite you, unfortunately we don't have elections now, but I will invite you to see the manner in which things are dealt with in our polling station. The instance as which that card is held up. And when you can really see that card when it is held up. The fact that very many people, and the parties have to be blamed, because very often the agents don't do a good job. You go into a polling station, they have the profiles, and they're not even using them.
So, Mr. Alexander, then you have to take blame for that as well, because GECOM is the one who appoints these polling people. Agents.
GECOM has to take blame. Undoubtedly, GECOM has to take
blame. So you are at fault yourself if you did not train those people properly to look at those ID cards and look at the person's face. So you can't escape the blame.
Let me make 2 points about this. You say I have to take blame. As a part of the collective, I have to take blame. But as a part of the collective, I was never in favor of going to the elections with a bloated list, because once the list is not bloated, you can't facilitate those things. So even though I take blame individual, I distance myself. And I want to repeat something I said. In our polling stations, very often, the people who are in those polling stations are very, very local area and all of that. And therefore, very often there is a possibility that, if not all, the greater majority of them are inclined in a particular direction. And I'm not saying in any particular, in one part, in a particular direction. I would argue that if you go to the petition of 2015, you will see that the PPP argued the same thing. We were very convenient in what we argue when. You will see the point I'm making about people being able to do things was argued by the PPP in the 2015 petition. Suddenly in 2020, it can't happen.
Okay, Mr. Alexander, Charles, you don't mind me interrupt there. Mr. Alexander, quickly, I'm going to ask you some very short questions. Do you believe Mr. Lowenfield was constitutionally appointed and is independent of the GECOM chair and the commissioners, or he had to take advice from the commissioners? That's an easy answer.
He has to take advice from the commissioners, and the system worked in so far as the commissioners and the chairperson gave him advice and did not entertain his imaginations.
Okay, so what some of the coalition lawyers were arguing that he's independent and don't have to take advice, they were wrong. But that's beside the point.
Just take a pin. There are people who are of the view that in some aspects there is some independence. We have to work with what the court has determined. We will have to accept and work with what the court has determined.
I want to ask you a question now. He was asked to tabulate the election results and return based on the results submitted, the SOP submitted. He came back in his first submission that 275,000 people were spoiled ballots, either dead or migrated and voted. Do you believe that number?
Right or wrong, what Lowenfield did was to take the reports that had been received from the immigration office and the report that was received from the registrar of deaths office. But he also took into consideration the anomalies that were being recorded during the recount. So that is what led him to the figure. And he took those into consideration, wrongly or rightly, based on his interpretation of what the appeal court at that point in time had said what the appeal court at that level votes to be counted. He gave an interpretation. The commission did not allow that through. The commission stopped that.
Okay, now you're saying he got death certificates and so forth, but you're not telling me if you believe that. Now, in his second attempt, he disqualified 115,000 votes. But let me just ask you this question. Mr. Lowenfield said he perused the list of voters and he came up with these answers within a matter of a week, that in the first instance, 275,000 people were not eligible to vote. They were either dead or migrated. In the second, it was only 15,000. Given a third or fourth chance, maybe he would have come with other numbers. But the question to you is this. This is the same Mr. Lowenfield who said, and he told this to the world, that it would take 156 days to count 460,000 votes. Mr. Alexander, based on Mr. Lowenfield's calculation, it will take 119 years to count the 920 million people that voted in India in the last election. But he himself came up with the answer, can go back to the list, and he can do it within a matter of 5 to 7 days. Where do we stand with a personality like this? And my ultimate question is this. Do you believe that Mr. Mingo did anything wrong? Mr. Lowenfield did anything wrong? Ms. Miles did anything wrong? Today, Mr. Lowenfield will draw his case from the court, so which could lead to the termination of his contract. But I'm asking you point blank, did these people did anything wrong during the election? What the world saw? Because if they want to rig an election, you can't do it in the social media age. So I'm asking you, do you believe that Mingo did anything wrong when he put up those fake numbers and everyone saw them in Region 4?
One at a time. In terms of our electoral system, Mingo is to produce a result for District 4. Mingo has that responsibility beyond the presence and the involvement of the central electoral machinery. For me to pronounce on Mingo requires that he is allowed to bring those figures before the commission. Those figures never came before the commission, and in the absence of them never coming before the commission, I'm not committed to response on them. Lowenfield on Lowenfield, I've already said to you my disposition in terms of what Lowenfield's rationale for the figures that he brought. However, the commission ruled on them, and the system that's there to ensure that the true and fair results in that regard work. Notwithstanding the tension that people may have, that the overall system didn't work because things happened at various points along the way that allowed for the result not to reflect true will of the people of Ghana. It's against that background that my judgment was and is that there was no basis for a declaration.
Okay, Mr. Alexander, have you seen APNU's statement of polls?
If I've seen, no, I have not seen that.
Okay, now
the statements which I saw were the ones which were collecting an exercise which was aborted because the PPP commissioners thought it more critical for them to be somewhere else rather than to continue the process of collecting those statements, which would have put them in a position, and I dare say us, from day one. The question of a recount would never have arisen. All that would have happened, let's presume that Mingo was producing false results and Lowenfield was trying to bring them forward. Like I did in 2011, we would have thrown up our figures, and that would have been it. Those 5 months that are being complained about would not have been necessary. We away from our obligations to do certain things at certain times, presuming that what we were doing was the best thing to do. And therefore, I contend, and I've said it publicly, that some of what occurred was contrived.
Okay.
Because if he had done the correct thing, those things would not have occurred.
You said that there were 29 boxes up the East Coast that had
47.
no paperwork. 47. Now, why you did not advocate that those returning officers, GECOM employees, be charged for not, because they were in charge of those polling stations? Why you did not advocate for them to be charged for not producing those documents?
I couldn't make that advocacy. What was required in the first instance is an investigation as to what occurred. You can't just charge people like that. What occurred, where they went missing, how they went missing. I advocate for an inquiry into that and let the chips fall where they may. I'm still an advocate for it, and let the chips fall where they may. I don't know what went wrong with them.
But GECOM has to be blamed. Do you agree to that? Now,
GECOM has to take responsibility in that.
I agree with you.
The agents of GECOM.
Exactly. Mr. Alexander, several press reports has confirmed that on the night around 8:30, 9 o'clock of March 2nd, Mr. Granger called Mr. Lowenfield and Commissioner Claudette Singh to congratulate them on a fair and peaceful elections. But during the recount, we ran all these problems that came up. And until now, the Chief Justice threw them out of the court because said there was no evidence to prove that. Why is it that Mr. Granger could call and say these things, and then all of a sudden, he allowed persons within his own party to make representation in the court to disqualify the results? You might not be able to answer the question, Mr. Granger should be able to answer the question. But the other question, the point I want to mention to you is this.
Say that if I'm not mistaken, the dateline you're talking to, Granger's, if he did call, I don't know, if he did call, he was speaking to the conduct of the elections, and everyone spoke to that conduct up to that point and said that they had no problem with it. Everyone said that. But what is controversial is what happened after, not what happened up to the end. That, as everybody said that GECOM had done a good job in conducting.
He said
He's not referring to the
this was part of his statement. He said, based on the reports I received from across the country, the election were fairly conducted. He said, based on the reports he received. But that's another question I want to ask you. Were you aware that Mr. Granger conceded to President Ali somewhere around the 3rd or the 4th that he had lost the election and congratulated President Ali?
I have no knowledge of that.
Okay.
I have no knowledge of that.
Okay. Charles?
Mr. Alexander, I just want to go back to, as we are on the Region 4, did the commission, as a commissioner, did you receive all the statement of polls from the other 9 regions?
Yes, we did. And how did it happen?
No. Okay, no. You received it.
How did it happen? This is important.
Okay.
We sat and we were going through region, district by district. So we signed off.
At the commission level?
At the commission level. We were in the throes of signing off on Region 4 when the fracas occurred and the commissioners abandoned the exercise, and therefore, because they abandoned the exercise, we were not in receipt of Region 4. And it's so coincidental that we were at the East Coast at the time when what occurred, and they never came back to sign off or receive. So
Okay, can we go? I know we were out of time, but if you can go through in sequence, how many of Region 4 statement of polls did the commission receive after it was?
After what?
After the shenanigans began, as you said, after the PEP commissioner.
Commissioners received none. After the shenanigans, none.
None from
before. We received the East Bank, we received Georgetown, we hardly received East Coast.
Oh, so you got East Bank and part of Georgetown?
Yes.
How many total statement of polls you got of that? I mean, in total?
I don't have a total figure.
Okay.
We weren't at that point. Totally.
Now, Mr. Alexander, you know there were like 2,300 polling stations in Guyana, right? So you have 2,300 polling statement of polls. Why only 47 in East Coast was the problem and not from the other 2,300 statement of polls?
That is still to be determined. I don't know.
Don't you
think that as you are? And I think that we ought to be involved in inquiry to make that determination.
Has the commission undertaken to investigate why this 47 did not comply with the regulation that they had during their training?
The commission has not undertaken to investigate that. The commission went off on its own frolic in the first instance, engaging in private criminal charges. Some commissioners were involved in private criminal charges. They were not looking back to GECOM system to interrogate what happened. They merely pointed a finger at certain people and went off on private criminal charges, and we still have not, as a commission, looked to see where GECOM went wrong.
And I just want to mention,
what went wrong.
I know, and I just want to mention one thing. You mentioned sorry, I'm going back to that, but you received report from the police commissioner that people left the country and voted, and the dead people voted. But
what I received, the commission received.
But a lot of those
reports I received, the commission received.
But you know, a lot of those reports were debunked because those people came forward, and a lot of them said they were in the country, they never leave, and people who claim, but that's a different story altogether. Now,
I don't know that a lot of those were debunked.
Well, according to the report in the media, it was.
Right? Media reports all sorts of things.
That's correct. Mr. Alexander, do you think the PPP is an installed government?
My disposition is this, that the extent to which we got to the point where we got, GECOM declared result, the PPP is a government.
So Amen. They're elected by the people, in your opinion.
I have questions about what occurred, but there's a system in place, and one has to deal with what the system threw up. The system threw up certain things, and as a commissioner, that is what one has to accept. I myself did not render a vote for or against the results because of my concerns, but the commission, as a majority body, declared a result.
Did you relay that? Did you relay that to the leader of the opposition? Your sentiment?
What?
About
my sentiments are public.
Okay. Do you think the commissioner, as GECOM is composed right now, the composition of GECOM, is that working or should it be changed?
I have previously expressed the view that what we have is not the best. I've expressed that view. I've also said, however, that we know what we have, we don't know what we'll get. And I've said that because I do not believe that we have in our society a robust civil society that can give to us persons. So I have a difficulty in a situation where you will presume they are unbiased and they're biased, as opposed to a situation where you know what you have biased people.
So you think
it's a conundrum.
So in your opinion, the civil society is more biased than what we have at GECOM now?
Oh, our civil society, I think, is rather biased.
So you don't think we have 6 good men or women in Guyana who can become independent commissioners of GECOM?
We could have 6, but I don't know if we can find them because it's the politicians who put up these names. Have 6, I don't know if we can find them. The politicians put up these names. You look to see the names that were put up for the chairman of the commission. How many of them have ended up in political parties? How many of them have ended up in high positions in government, and what has happened and all of that?
In your view, should the way the commissioners and the chairman is elected, should that be changed?
Ideally, it should be changed. But I have reservations given the landscape, the political landscape in Guyana, and the way in which many people who purport to be of civil society sit in that landscape.
Should we bring in foreigners to run our elections?
I think that there are things we should do. For example, I would be an advocate of some elements of electronic voting. I would feel that at the point of identification, that we should use to identify the voters, that can deal with the problem I've identified of impersonation. Use biometrics. I've seen it used in other places, where somebody is identified not by a pitch in the ear. There is an automated system where you place your fingers. The system says that this fingerprints represents the fingerprints of the person whose name is against the prints and who has presented himself with an ID card.
Yeah, but the question is, no, can we have CARICOM or the Commonwealth run our elections?
I think that there are things we can do technologically without having to rely on the CARICOM or the Commonwealth.
Okay. Dr. Rose?
Oh, Mr. Alexander, going back to the PNC party, we've had enough on elections and politics now. As been reported in the media, the party is divided, it's fractured. There are factions within the party. What do you think is happening? And is it good for the party at this stage?
Oh, it's certainly not good for the party. It's certainly not good for the party. I think the problem, I see no problem with competition. I advocate competition. I advocate competition. I think that we have a problem which has put me where I am in competition, and that the party has to overcome in terms of its political culture. All of the people involved have in one way or the other, one time or the other, opposed for open competition.
I know you're not a member of the party, but like most Caribbean countries, when a leader loses an election, he or she resigns. Do you think President Granger should resign? Former President Granger should resign as leader of the party?
That has not been the tradition. It's not been the tradition here. And if my idea of a freed up system, then there are two possibilities. There's a possibility that the will of the people will determine whether a leader stays or not. And secondly, with that possibility in place, leaders may consider it necessary to resign.
He says he's the only one to lead the party back to victory in 2025. He'll be 80 years old then. Do you think the party need an 18-year-old to lead it in 2025?
I think that is gamesmanship.
Okay. My final question to you. Given the pandemic, which is reaping havoc on not only Guyana, but in many countries around the world, including the United States and those countries, and given the massive floods that took place in Guyana recently, do you think President Orfanali is doing a good job to steer the country in a path and a direction towards progress?
President Orfanali is saying all of the right things. President Orfanali's government is doing many things opposite to what he is saying. We have a crisis of governance in Guyana, in my view. President Ali went to the office of the president when he was elected, high-fived everybody and told them, you're all going to be okay, no problem. And a few mornings after, 0.5% home. He's saying all of the right things and doing many of the wrong things.
And my last question to you is this. Do you think local government elections will be held this year?
It seems very difficult in terms of the period for preparation.
Charles?
We have squandered time. We have squandered time and may be well out of be ready for an election in November, December.
Mr. Alexander, in closing, if President Ali said, Mr. Alexander, come, I want you to work with me in my administration, what would Vincent Alexander say to the president?
Let me answer that question this way. Prior to the elections and during the count, President Ali privately said to me he wanted me to work with his regime. In the previous regime, I was appointed to the National Council by the Minister of Education and served up to the announcement of the last results, at which time I tendered my resignation. At this point in time, given what is happening in government, I'm unprepared to associate myself in the same manner in which I disassociated myself from the People's National Congress.
But if you can be a changing force being part of the PPP,
I don't think a one man will be the changing force.
No, listen.
I don't think so.
It was only one man. Mahatma Gandhi led India here. We had Martin Luther King, one man. They had behind them had people, but they were one man. Alexander the Great was one man. Let
me put it this way. I would, for me, taken up any position with any party, I would have to have a conversation where the party gives me certain guarantees in terms of their policies and their practices. I haven't had that conversation, but I haven't seen the policies and practices that I would wish to be associated with. So from where I sit now, the answer would have to be no. If I'm called upon, it would depend on the conversation.
Very good answer.
Excellent. Mr. Alexander, we want to thank you so much for being with us this evening, for spending this time with us. You have answered your question frontally and frankly. I know, as I said before at the beginning, some of our audience might not accept your answers, others will, but that's the nature of the game. But we want to thank you so much for coming on. We want to thank our audience for being with us tonight. We want to thank Nohar Singh and, of course, Devin Bissu. And to you, Dr. Rose. Mr. Alexander, anything in closing tonight?
Well, I have attempted to be frank and to express views on matters, since I'm someone not obligated to the party, though I may have political inclinations, as any citizen should have. I know there are people out there who will throw stones. That's the nature of things. But I live with and by my country.
Thank you, Mr. Alexander.
Mr. Alexander, I want to congratulate you. And I want to tell all Guyanese that if there's one frank person in Guyana, his name is Vincent Alexander. Folks, you have just heard it here. He did not back away from the questions. He did not fall into anything to say, well, support a party because of its wrongdoing. He made it clear that if the PP did not abandon the process of counting Region 4, it would not have been delayed for 5 months. And he said he did not see the statement of polls from the coalition government. But he said he made it clear that, well, GECOM declared a government. It's an official elected government. Folks, you just heard it here. Vincent Alexander is our man of the year. Globespan man of the year. Thank you, sir.
All right.
Thank you very much. My head is full.
Thank you, Dr. Rose. Those are really good words of Vincent. And Ms. Alexander, we want to thank you again. To our audience, thank you. And to all Guyana, God bless you. God bless our great nation.